Gary Hoffman stirred his cream of nebula soup absently, watching the swirls of purple and blue cosmic dust dance around chunks of condensed starlight. His tiny apartment kitchen barely contained his lanky frame, and he had to duck to avoid hitting his head on the light fixture as he reached for the salt. Outside his window, the glass and steel spires of the city glittered in the afternoon sunlight, hovering cars zooming between buildings in orderly lines. "I'm telling you, Morris, today's the day," Gary said, glancing at the terrarium on his counter where his emerald-scaled lizard lounged on a heated rock. "I'm going to ask Sheila from 4B out for coffee. I've been practicing what to say all morning." Morris flicked his tongue dismissively and turned his back. "Oh, come on, I'm not that hopeless," Gary protested, slurping a spoonful of soup. "Just because the last 3 women I asked out said no doesn't mean—" A sharp pain shot through his mouth. Gary spat into his napkin and examined the offending object. A small, curved white sliver. "What the—" He squinted at it. "Is that a toenail clipping? How did that get in my soup?" He wrinkled his nose and tossed it in the trash along with the rest of the soup. "That's the last time I buy discount soup from Galactic Grocers." Gary checked his watch. Almost time for his afternoon delivery shift at Intergalactic Parcel Service. He slipped into his navy blue uniform, complete with the IPS logo of a rocket ship circling a cardboard box. "Don't overthrow the household while I'm gone," he told Morris, who was now stretched out regally across the terrarium. "I know that's what you're planning." Morris closed one eye in what Gary always interpreted as a wink of confirmation. 23 days later, Gary had completely forgotten about the toenail incident. Life continued in its predictable routine. Deliver packages within a 3-mile radius of the IPS office, come home to Morris's increasingly elaborate but completely imaginary plans for lizard domination, and fail spectacularly at asking out Sheila from 4B. He was just setting up Morris's dinner, precisely 5 crickets, no more, no less, when a thunderous knock rattled his apartment door. Gary froze. He wasn't expecting company, and his landlord usually sent threatening emails about late rent rather than making personal appearances. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Coming, coming," Gary called, brushing cricket dust from his hands. He opened the door to find a short, squat figure in what appeared to be a spacesuit cobbled together from recycled aluminum cans and duct tape. The helmet's visor was tinted dark green, obscuring the wearer's face completely. "Gary Hoffman?" The voice was muffled but distinctly female. "Yes?" "I am Ambassador Zeta, representative of the High Council of Improbable Events." The figure made a complex gesture with 3 of her 5 gloved fingers. "You have been summoned." Gary blinked. "Summoned? For what? I didn't do anything. If this is about that parking ticket, I already paid it online. Your presence is required at the Castle of Improbability. The dragons must be fed." "Dragons?" Gary felt a hysterical laugh building in his chest. "Look, I think you have the wrong guy. I feed Morris over there." He gestured to the terrarium. "And that's the extent of my reptile feeding responsibilities." Ambassador Zeta tilted her helmeted head. "The toenail has dissolved. The selection is made. You have 20 minutes to pack a bag. Bring the lizard." She turned and marched down the hallway toward the elevator. "Wait, what toenail? What dragons? Where is this castle?" Gary called after her. 20 minutes, Mr. Hoffman," she called back without turning. "The consequences of refusal are improbable." Gary stood in his doorway, mouth agape, as the elevator doors closed behind Ambassador Zeta. He glanced back at Morris, who had perched on his hind legs and was staring at Gary with unusual intensity. "You know something about this, don't you?" Gary accused. Morris bobbed his head in what was unmistakably a nod. Gary's knees suddenly felt weak. He staggered back into his apartment and sank into his second-hand couch. This can't be happening. Dragons aren't real. Castles of improbability aren't real. Talking lizards aren't real. "I'm not talking. You're just finally listening properly," a dry, sarcastic voice said in Gary's head. Gary screamed and fell off the couch. Asterisk, "Oh, pull yourself together." Morris's voice continued in his mind. Asterisk, "We have 17 minutes now, and you still need to pack." "You can talk? You've always been able to talk?" Gary's voice had risen several octaves. Asterisk, telepathically communicate. Yes, talk. No, no vocal cords suitable for human speech. But that's beside the point. Pack. Now, toothbrush. That ridiculous guide to self-confidence you never read. And my terrarium. The blue heating rock, not the red one. The red one gets too hot. Still in shock, Gary found himself obeying. He grabbed a duffel bag from his closet and began stuffing it with the items Morris had mentioned, plus a few changes of clothes and his phone charger. "What's happening?" he asked as he carefully lifted Morris's terrarium. "Why me? What dragons?" Asterisk. The cosmic dragons that maintain the engine of reality. Obviously. Morris replied with the mental equivalent of an eye roll. Asterisk. As for why you, pure cosmic coincidence. The creator's toenail clipping fell into your soup, dissolved in the nebula cream, and now you're connected to the fabric of improbability. Bad luck, honestly. You can barely feed me correctly. That's not fair, Gary protested as he zipped up his bag. I always give you exactly 5 crickets. Asterisk, and they're always slightly stale. Before Gary could defend his cricket procurement practices, another knock came at the door. Time to go, Mr. Hoffman. Ambassador Zeta called through the door. With a deep breath, Gary slung his bag over his shoulder, picked up Morris's terrarium, and opened the door. I still think this is a massive mistake. The engine of reality doesn't make mistakes. Ambassador Zeta replied, It makes improbabilities. The elevator ride down to the ground floor was the longest of Gary's life. Not because the elevator was particularly slow, though it did stop at every floor despite no one getting on or off, but because his mind was racing with questions, none of which Ambassador Zeta seemed inclined to answer. So, these dragons, Gary tried again as they reached the lobby. How many are there? What do they eat? Do they breathe fire? Are they big? You will be provided with the appropriate manuals. Ambassador Zeta replied, marching toward the main entrance. All dragon feeders receive adequate orientation. Wait, dragon feeders? There are others? There have been many before you. There will be many after. What happened to the last one? Gary asked, a sense of dread building in his stomach. Ambassador Zeta paused infinitesimally. He retired. That's ambassador speak for became dragon food, Asterisk Morris commented in Gary's head. Not helping, Morris, Gary muttered. Outside, instead of the usual busy street, a gleaming vehicle awaited them. It resembled a giant metallic beetle, complete with iridescent shell and multiple jointed legs. Your transport, Ambassador Zeta announced, pressing a spot on the beetle's shell. A door opened in its side, revealing a plush interior with leather seats and what looked like a fully stocked bar. We're going in that? Gary asked weakly. The Castle of Improbability is not accessible by conventional means. Gary climbed in, clutching Morris's terrarium to his chest. Ambassador Zeta followed, closing the door behind them. The interior lights dimmed, and a control panel lit up with symbols Gary didn't recognize. Destination, Castle of Improbability. Ambassador Zeta announced. The beetle vehicle shuddered, then shot forward with such force that Gary was pressed back into his seat. Outside the windows, the city blurred and then shifted. Buildings stretched and contracted, streets twisted into impossible angles, and the sky cycled through colors that shouldn't exist. Gary squeezed his eyes shut, feeling nauseated. How long is this trip going to take? Time is relative in the folds between realities, Ambassador Zeta replied. But approximately 47 minutes and 33 seconds, accounting for traffic. Traffic? What kind of traffic exists between realities? You'd be surprised how congested the probability lanes get during rush hour. Gary decided that keeping his eyes closed was the better part of valor. He focused on his breathing and tried not to think about what awaited him at their destination. Asterisk, you should ask about the pay, Morris suggested in his mind. Asterisk, if we're going to be feeding cosmic dragons, we should at least get hazard pay. Is this a paid position? Gary asked, eyes still firmly shut. The caretaker of the cosmic dragons receives compensation commensurate with the responsibility. Ambassador Zeta responded, housing, meals, and interdimensional health insurance are provided, plus 2 weeks of vacation annually, which can be taken simultaneously across multiple parallel dimensions. That actually sounds pretty good, Gary admitted. Ask about retirement benefits. Morris prompted, "What about retirement?" "Most caretakers don't reach retirement age." Ambassador Zeta said matter-of-factly, "But the pension plan for survivors is quite generous." Survivors? Gary's eyes snapped open just in time to see their vehicle plunge straight down into what appeared to be a massive whirlpool in the middle of a lake that definitely hadn't been there a moment ago. The Beetle vehicle submerged completely, but instead of filling with water, the interior remained dry as they descended through swirling currents. Bizarre fish with too many eyes and geometric patterns for scales darted past the windows. "Submersible capabilities," Ambassador Zeta explained, noticing Gary's panicked expression. "Standard feature for interdimensional transport." Just when Gary thought things couldn't get any stranger, the water outside the windows transformed into something else, a thick, gelatinous substance that glowed with an inner light. Through this semi-transparent medium, he could make out the silhouette of an enormous structure looming ahead. The Castle of Improbability. It defied architectural logic. Towers spiraled in directions that hurt Gary's eyes to follow. Bridges connected seemingly random points without regard for gravity. The entire structure appeared to be made of dark stone that occasionally rippled like liquid. "Home sweet home," Ambassador Zeta announced as their vehicle emerged from the gelatinous moat and came to rest on a perfectly ordinary-looking cobblestone driveway. Gary stumbled out of the Beetle vehicle, his legs wobbly from the journey. The air around the castle smelled faintly of cinnamon and ozone. Above, the sky was a deep indigo, despite it having been afternoon when they left his apartment. "This way," Ambassador Zeta said, leading him toward a massive doorway flanked by statues of creatures that resembled dragons, only in the vaguest sense. They had too many limbs and not enough eyes, or vice versa. The doors swung open as they approached, revealing a cavernous entry hall lit by floating orbs of multicolored light. A figure waited for them inside, what appeared to be a mechanical person made entirely of brass gears and silver joints, clutching a quill and parchment. "New caretaker arrival," Ambassador Zeta announced. "Gary Hoffman, selected by toenail dissolution in nebula cream." The automaton scribe made a series of clicking and whirring noises, then scratched something on the parchment. "The automaton scribe will record your orientation," Ambassador Zeta explained to Gary. "Standard procedure." "Oh, orientation?" Gary stuttered, still struggling to process everything around him. "Yes, you must be properly instructed in your duties before your first feeding. The dragons operate on a strict schedule." Gary followed Ambassador Zeta and the clicking scribe down a series of corridors that seemed to subtly rearrange themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them. They passed doors made of materials ranging from ordinary wood to what appeared to be solidified lightning. "The Castle of Improbability contains many mysteries," Ambassador Zeta said as they walked. "Most are not relevant to your duties. Do not explore without authorization. Some doors lead to places from which there is no return." "Noted," Gary said weakly. "No unauthorized exploring?" "Boring," Morris commented. "The first thing we're doing when they leave us alone is exploring." "Absolutely not," Gary muttered. Ambassador Zeta stopped before a massive door made of what appeared to be black metal, inlaid with swirling silver patterns that moved like slow-motion whirlpools. "The Dragon Chamber," she announced. "Your primary workplace." The door swung open silently despite its apparent weight, revealing a vast circular room with a domed ceiling that somehow contained what looked like an actual galaxy. The floor was polished stone inlaid with intricate patterns that subtly shifted every few seconds. Around the perimeter were 3 enormous alcoves, each containing what Gary could only assume were the dragons. But they weren't dragons in any conventional sense. The first resembled a serpentine creature composed entirely of blue crystal, segments shifting and rotating in hypnotic patterns. Where its eyes should have been were swirling vortices that seemed to contain miniature storms. The second was a mass of molten material, constantly flowing and reshaping itself, occasionally forming recognizable features, a claw here, a wing there, before dissolving back into its churning form. It glowed with an inner light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The third was the most unsettling, a dragon-shaped void in reality. Gary could see through it to the wall behind, but the wall appeared distorted, as if viewed through a heat haze. The edges of this void dragon rippled and wavered, occasionally extending tendrils of nothingness that dissolved anything they touched. All three were restrained by chains that glowed with arcane energy, anchoring them to their respective alcoves. The cosmic dragons. Ambassador Zeta said, her voice hushed with what sounded like reverence. Azurite, Keeper of Time, Ember Scale, Weaver of Energy, and Void Fang, Master of Space. They are the trinity that maintains the engine of reality. Gary stood frozen, Morris's terrarium clutch forgotten in his hands. They're magnificent, Morris whispered in his mind, and for once, his mental voice lacked any trace of sarcasm. They're chained, Gary finally managed to say. A necessary precaution. Ambassador Zeta replied, their power is immense, uncontrolled. They could unravel reality itself. In the center of the chamber stood a large, circular table, surrounded by cabinets of various sizes and materials. The table contained 3 enormous bowls, each positioned to be within reach of one of the dragons when extended to the edge of the table. Your workstation, Ambassador Zeta explained, leading Gary to the table. Each feeding requires precise preparation according to the manual. She gestured to a large, leather-bound book resting on the table. Its title, embossed in gold letters, read, The Care and Feeding of Cosmic Dragons. The dragons must be fed twice daily. Ambassador Zeta continued, Morning and evening. Though time functions differently here, you'll be notified when each feeding is due. Gary set Morris's terrarium down on a smaller side table and approached the workstation cautiously. What do they eat? Open the manual to page 1, Ambassador Zeta instructed. Your first feeding is scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. I will leave you to prepare. The automaton scribe will remain to record your performance. Wait, Gary called as Ambassador Zeta turned to leave. That's it? Just read the manual and good luck? Don't I get any training, a demonstration, anything? Ambassador Zeta paused at the door. The manual is comprehensive. The ingredients are labeled. The dragons are restrained. You have been chosen by the toenail of the Creator. Trust in the improbability. And with that, she was gone, the massive door swinging shut behind her with a definitive thud. Gary turned to the automaton scribe, which stood impassively nearby, quill poised over parchment. I don't suppose you have any helpful advice. The scribe made a series of clicks and whirs, then wrote something on its parchment and held it up for Gary to see. Don't panic. Don't die. Follow instructions. Great, Gary muttered. Very helpful. Let's see what's in this book. Morris suggested, asterisk. And maybe check out those cabinets. 20 minutes isn't long to prepare cosmic dragon food. Gary approached the manual with trepidation and opened it to the first page. Welcome, caretaker. He read aloud. The feeding of the cosmic dragons is a sacred duty entrusted only to those selected by the dissolution of the Creator's toenail clipping in an appropriate medium. Your selection indicates a unique resonance with the engine of reality. That's me, Gary said sarcastically. Uniquely resonant with reality. Just ask my empty bank account and failed love life. He continued reading. Each dragon requires a specific diet formulated to maintain their connection to their respective cosmic domain. Improper feeding may result in reality fluctuations, tears in the space-time continuum, or spontaneous existence failure. Spontaneous existence failure? Gary squeaked. Is that a fancy way of saying death? Asterisk, I think it means the end of everything. Morris supplied helpfully. Asterisk, keep reading. The next pages contain detailed instructions for each dragon's meal. Azurite, the time dragon, required a paste made from ground historical artifacts mixed with the essence of possible futures. Ember Scale needed a diet of star energy in various stages of development. And Voidfang consumed nothing, literally nothing, but prepared in a very specific way. How do you prepare nothing? Gary wondered aloud. Asterisk, maybe the cabinets will enlighten us, Morris suggested. Gary began opening the cabinets surrounding the workspace. Each was meticulously labeled and contained the strangest assortment of ingredients he had ever seen. One cabinet held jars of what appeared to be moments in time, frozen like insects in amber. Another contained spheres of light in various colors, labeled with star types and ages. A third held nothing but empty containers of different shapes and sizes, each labeled with a different type of nothing: quantum void, existential absence, conceptual emptiness. "This is insane," Gary muttered, taking out the ingredients listed for Azurite's meal. "I'm supposed to grind up this ancient arrowhead and mix it with this jar labeled Stock Market Crash, 2031. That's in the future. Asterisk time is relative for cosmic dragons." Morris pointed out, "Asterisk, just follow the instructions." With shaking hands, Gary began preparing the meals according to the manual. For Azurite, he ground the arrowhead with a mortar and pestle, then mixed in the future event, creating a shimmering paste that occasionally showed flickering images of people panicking in front of digital displays. For Ember Scale, he selected 3 star orbs as instructed: a young blue giant, a middle-aged yellow dwarf, which looked suspiciously like Earth's sun, and a dying red dwarf, and arranged them in the second bowl. For Void Fang, he selected one of the empty containers labeled Primordial Nothing, and, following the bizarrely specific instructions, left it empty but thought about the concept of emptiness for exactly 67 seconds while holding the container. As Gary completed the preparations, a soft chime sounded throughout the chamber. The dragons, which had been relatively still, began to stir in their alcoves. "I guess that's the dinner bell," Gary said nervously. "Asterisk, good luck," Morris offered. "Asterisk, try not to end reality as we know it." The circular table began to move, extending sections toward each of the dragons like spokes on a wheel. The chains restraining the dragons allowed them just enough movement to reach the bowls now positioned before them. Azurite was the first to feed, extending a crystalline appendage that dipped into the time paste. The paste adhered to the crystal, then seemed to absorb into it, causing Azurite's blue segments to pulse with new patterns. Ember Scale's molten form flowed toward its bowl, and 3 tendrils extended to engulf each of the star orbs. The dragon's glow intensified with each absorption, changing colors to match each star temporarily before settling back into its usual molten gold. Voidfang approached its bowl last, the void shape hovering over the empty container. What happened next defied Gary's understanding. The emptiness in the bowl seemed to connect with the emptiness of the dragon, creating a momentary black hole that pulled at Gary's clothes before collapsing back into itself. When all 3 dragons had finished, they retreated to their alcoves, their movements seeming somehow more satisfied, more settled. The table retracted, bringing the now empty bowls back to the center of the chamber. Gary stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. Had he done it correctly? Was reality still intact? A deep, resonant voice suddenly filled the chamber, though none of the dragons had visibly spoken. Time paste, interesting texture, historical significance adequately represented, future potential slightly sandy on the temporal palette. A second voice, this one crackling like fire. Star selection bold, but effective. The dying dwarf added a pleasant finish. Consider including a supernova next time for more pop. A third voice, more absence than sound, like words formed from the space between thoughts. The nothing was adequate. But we sense you don't truly understand void. Think harder about nothingness next time. Gary blinked. They talk? Asterisk, of course they talk, Morris replied. They're cosmic dragons, not goldfish. First feeding assessment, satisfactory. The voices said in unison. Caretaker shows promise. Rest period authorized. The automaton scribe made a series of pleased-sounding clicks and wrote something on its parchment. It approached Gary and showed him what it had written. Congratulations! You didn't cause spontaneous existence failure. Follow me to your quarters. Gary looked back at the dragons, which had settled into what he assumed was a post-meal rest. That's it? I just leave them? Next feeding in 12 hours, Azurite's voice informed him. We recommend study and reflection until then. Feeling dazed, Gary collected Morris's terrarium and followed the automaton scribe out of the dragon chamber and down more impossible corridors until they reached a surprisingly normal-looking wooden door. Inside was a comfortable apartment, complete with a bed, sitting area, kitchen, and a desk covered in journals and reference materials. A window looked out onto a landscape that shifted between a mountainous vista and an ocean view every few minutes. Your quarters. The automaton scribe wrote, "Food in kitchen. Questions to journal. Sleep recommended." The scribe then backed out of the room, closing the door behind it. Gary set Morris's terrarium on a table by the window and collapsed onto the bed. What just happened? Did I really just feed cosmic dragons that maintain reality? Asterisk, you did, Morris confirmed, climbing out of his terrarium to bask in a patch of sunlight on the table. Asterisk, and you didn't destroy existence in the process. I'd call that a win. They talked about my cooking, Gary said, staring at the ceiling. Cosmic dragons critiqued my cooking? Asterisk, they seem to like it, mostly. Just a few suggestions for improvement. The void one is going to be tricky, though. How do you improve on nothing? I have no idea. Gary sat up and looked around the room. They said to study and reflect. Maybe these journals will help. He approached the desk and picked up the topmost journal. Opening it, he found page after page of notes in elegant handwriting, detailing feeding formulas, dragon behaviors, and philosophical musings on the nature of reality. This must be from the previous caretaker, Gary said, flipping through the pages. One entry caught his eye. Day 873. Discovered today that the dragons prefer variety. Azurite responded exceptionally well to a mixture of 3 possible futures rather than the standard one. Ember Scale enjoys contrasting star types. The greater the difference in development stage, the more satisfied the reaction. And Voidfang. I'm beginning to understand that Voidfang doesn't just want nothing, but the contemplation of nothing. The distinction between emptiness and nothingness is subtle but crucial. This is actually helpful, Gary said, surprised. Asterisk. Look for more recent entries, Morris suggested. Asterisk. Maybe there's something about why the previous caretaker left. Gary flipped to the last written page in the journal and found a short, cryptic note. They don't maintain, they sabotage evolution, not preservation. Remember, variety, possibility, emptiness. What does that mean? Gary wondered aloud. The dragons don't maintain reality? They sabotage it? Asterisk sounds ominous, Morris commented. Asterisk, but also kind of interesting. Gary spent the next several hours poring over the journals and reference materials, trying to make sense of his new role and the cryptic message from his predecessor. The more he read, the more questions he had, but also the more intrigued he became. When the time for the second feeding approached, Gary felt a curious mixture of nervousness and anticipation. This time, he decided to experiment a bit, incorporating what he'd learned from the journals. For Azurite, he created a paste using 3 different historical artifacts and 3 possible futures instead of just one. For Ember Scale, he selected stars with more dramatic differences in their life cycles. And for Voidfang, he prepared an empty bowl but then spent 3 minutes meditating on the concept of non-existence before presenting it. The results were dramatic. Azurite's crystalline form glowed with unprecedented brightness after consuming the time paste. Ember Scale's molten body formed more complex and stable shapes, briefly resembling a traditional dragon before dissolving back into flowing magma. And Voidfang. Voidfang's void shape seemed to deepen somehow, becoming more defined by its very absence. Improvement noted. The dragons communicated in unison. Caretaker learns quickly. Thank you, Gary replied hesitantly. I found the previous caretaker's notes helpful. A moment of silence followed, as if the dragons were considering his words. You have questions, Azurite stated. Many, Gary admitted, but one in particular. The last entry in the journal said that you don't maintain reality, you sabotage it. What does that mean? Another silence, longer this time. The chains restraining the dragons clinked softly as the creatures shifted in their alcoves. Truth is perspective. Ember Scale's fiery voice finally responded. From one view, maintenance. From another, sabotage. From ours, necessary evolution. I don't understand, Gary said. The engine of reality seeks stasis, Voidfang's empty voice explained. Perfect balance, unchanging order. But stasis is death, Azurite continued. Without change, without improbability, reality stagnates. So you introduce improbabilities, Gary guessed? Create change on purpose? Yes! The dragons hissed in unison, their voices resonating with approval. We are the agents of necessary chaos, the creators of evolution through improbability. Gary's mind raced. And the High Council, Ambassador Zeta, do they know? They believe we maintain. Emberscale replied, They fear change. They see only destruction and chaos, not creation. They chain us. Azurite added, a note of bitterness in its crystalline voice. Limit our influence to what they deem acceptable improbabilities. So why am I here? Gary asked. Why do you need a caretaker? The chains require management, Voidfang explained, and we require nourishment to influence reality even in our restricted state. A good caretaker, Azurite continued, understands the balance between too much chaos and too little, feeds us to promote healthy evolution, not stagnation or destruction. And the previous caretaker, what happened to him? The dragons were silent for a moment before Emberscale answered. Mr. Blinglesnaw served us well for many years. Then he discovered a passion for disco dancing and requested reassignment. Disco dancing? Gary repeated incredulously. An improbability we influenced. Voidfang admitted. He seemed stressed, needed a change. So he's not dead, just dancing? In a pocket dimension where disco never went out of style. Azurite confirmed. He sends postcards occasionally. Gary wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. The situation was absurd beyond measure, yet somehow deadly serious at the same time. So what happens now? He asked. Am I just supposed to keep feeding you and hope I don't mess up the balance of reality? For now, the dragons replied in unison. Until the next great realignment. Great realignment? Approximately every 837 years. Azurite explained. The engine of reality requires recalibration. The chains weaken. Our influence expands. Evolution accelerates. When is the next one due? In our time? 836 years, 5 months, 17 days, 4 hours, and 22 minutes. Emberscale stated precisely. Oh, Gary said, relieved. So not during my lifetime? Unless something improbable occurs. Voidfang's empty voice whispered. Before Gary could ask what that meant, a new voice spoke from behind him. I see they've told you the truth already. That's unusual. They must sense something special in you. Gary whirled around to find a tall, elegant person with shimmering silver hair and skin that seemed to shift colors like an oil slick in sunlight. They wore what appeared to be a white lab coat over formal attire, and carried a small case of gleaming instruments. Who are you? Gary demanded, automatically stepping between the newcomer and the dragons. Gerald, the person replied with a slight bow. The creator's pedicurist. The creator's pedicurist? Someone has to maintain those cosmic toenails, Gerald said with a shrug. It's a living. Asterisk. Ask if the toenail in your soup was deliberate, Morris prompted from his terrarium. Did you intentionally put a toenail clipping in my soup? Gary asked, following Morris's suggestion. Gerald looked offended. Certainly not. I maintain the highest standards of professional ethics. All clippings are properly disposed of in designated interdimensional receptacles. They paused, considering. However, occasionally the clippings have a will of their own. They are, after all, parts of the Creator. So it chose me? The toenail chose me? In a manner of speaking. Gerald replied, The toenail recognized a potential in you that resonates with the current needs of the engine of reality. What potential? I'm a delivery guy who can't even ask a woman out for coffee. Gerald smiled mysteriously. Perhaps that's precisely the point. The dragons need a caretaker who understands both the mundane and the extraordinary. Someone who can bridge ordinary reality and cosmic improbability. Gary sank into a chair that had conveniently appeared behind him. This is too much. I'm not qualified for this. None of the caretakers ever felt qualified, Gerald assured him. Yet here we are, reality still spinning along its improbable course. They approached the dragons with a familiar nod. "I've come for the regular check. The High Council has noticed some anomalies in the reality fabric." The dragons shifted uneasily in their alcoves, chains clinking. "What kind of anomalies?" Gary asked. "Nothing major," Gerald replied, opening their case and removing what looked like a stethoscope made of crystal and copper wire. "Just a few weather patterns that defy meteorological models, some statistical improbabilities in global lottery results. The usual." They proceeded to examine each dragon in turn, listening with the crystal stethoscope and making notes on a pad that changed colors with each word written. "Everything seems within acceptable parameters," Gerald announced after completing the examination. "Though I must say they seem more vibrant than usual. Your feeding techniques must agree with them, Gary." Gary felt an unexpected surge of pride at the compliment. "I just followed the manual and the previous caretaker's notes." "Ah, Mr. Blingle's Gnaw, how is he enjoying the disco dimension?" "You know about that?" "Of course. I arranged the transfer. Much more humane than the traditional retirement methods." Gary didn't want to ask what the traditional retirement methods involved. Gerald packed away their instruments and turned to Gary with a more serious expression. "I should warn you. The High Council is growing increasingly conservative about reality fluctuations. There's talk of implementing a new restraint system for the dragons, something that would limit their influence even further." The dragons growled in unison, a sound that resonated through Gary's bones. "But that would stifle evolution, wouldn't it?" Gary asked, surprising himself with how quickly he'd accepted the dragon's perspective. "Precisely," Gerald agreed. "But the Council fears change more than stagnation. They see themselves as preservers of order." "What can I do?" Gerald studied Gary thoughtfully. "Continue your experimental feedings. Document the results. Build a case for the positive effects of controlled improbability. And perhaps prepare for unexpected opportunities." With that cryptic advice, Gerald bid farewell to the dragons and departed, leaving Gary with more questions than answers. Over the next several weeks, Gary settled into his role as caretaker with increasing confidence. He expanded his feeding experiments, carefully documenting the results and observing the subtle changes in reality that followed. Morris proved to be an invaluable assistant, his sarcastic commentary keeping Gary grounded amid the cosmic absurdity of their situation. The dragons, for their part, seemed to grow more communicative and even friendly, sharing stories of past realities and the various evolutionary leaps they had influenced throughout history. The dinosaur extinction wasn't entirely our doing, Azurite admitted during one evening conversation after feeding. "But we may have nudged the asteroid a bit. Mammals showed such potential for complex consciousness." "And the internet?" Gary asked, having developed a habit of questioning the dragons about historical events. "Emberscale's influence." Voidfang answered, "Humanity needed a new way to connect and share energy." "And cat videos," Emberscale added with what sounded like pride. "Those were an unexpected bonus." Gary laughed, realizing how comfortable he had become in the presence of these cosmic entities. It was easy to forget they were chained gods capable of unraveling reality when they were discussing the evolutionary significance of feline social media stars. But the comfortable routine was shattered one morning when Gerald burst into the dragon chamber, their usual elegant composure noticeably disturbed. "The Council knows," they announced without preamble. "They've detected the pattern in your feedings. They're sending agents to reset the dragons to baseline function." "Reset?" Gary echoed, alarmed. "What does that mean?" "It means reducing them to near dormancy." Gerald explained grimly. "Minimal consciousness, minimal influence. The Council has decided that recent reality fluctuations exceed acceptable parameters." The dragons roared in unified protest, straining against their chains with unprecedented force. The very fabric of the chamber seemed to waver in response to their distress. "When are they coming?" Gary asked, his mind racing. "Imminently," Gerald replied. "Minutes, perhaps. I came as soon as I received word." Gary looked at the dragons, then at Morris, who had taken to riding on his shoulder during feedings. Asterisk, "We can't let them do this," Morris said in his mind. Asterisk, "Not just for the dragons, but for reality itself. Stagnation is death. remember? What can we do? Gary asked aloud. I'm just the caretaker. I don't have the power to stop the High Council. But you have influence over the dragon's energy, Gerald pointed out, and through them, influence over reality itself. An idea began to form in Gary's mind, a dangerous, improbable idea. The feeding, he said slowly. If I fed them something unprecedented, something that maximized their energy and influence temporarily, it could create a window of opportunity. Gerald finished, eyes widening. But it would be extremely risky. The chains might not hold under that kind of strain. If the council resets them, the chains will become prisons instead of restraints. Gary argued, at least this way there's a chance. A thunderous sound echoed through the castle, the arrival of the council's agents. Decide quickly, Gerald urged. We have minutes at most. Gary rushed to the cabinets, pulling out ingredients with a new sense of purpose. For Azurite, he gathered not just past artifacts and future possibilities, but present moments, things happening right now throughout reality, preserved in temporal stasis. For Ember Scale, he selected not just individual stars but entire stellar life cycles, from birth to supernova. And for Voidfang, he prepared the most difficult concept yet, the state of becoming that exists between something and nothing. As the sounds of approaching agents grew louder, Gary completed the preparations and extended the table toward the dragons. This is beyond the recommended feeding protocols. He told them, I don't know what will happen. We are prepared, the dragons replied in unison. The time for restraint is ending. The dragons consumed their meals just as the doors to the chamber burst open. Ambassador Zeta strode in, accompanied by a contingent of armored figures whose forms seemed to shift and change as if they couldn't decide on a consistent reality. Caretaker Hoffman, Ambassador Zeta called out, step away from the dragons immediately. By order of the High Council of Improbable Events, these entities are to be reset to baseline function. But something was happening to the dragons. Azurite's crystalline form pulsed with temporal energy. Scenes from past, present, and future visible within each segment. Emberscale's molten body expanded, taking on the colors and energies of an entire stellar life cycle simultaneously, and Voidfang's void shape deepened and clarified. The boundary between existence and non-existence made manifest. Most alarmingly, the chains restraining them began to change. Instead of limiting the dragon's movements, they seemed to be transforming into conduits, channeling the creature's enhanced energy rather than containing it. What have you done? Ambassador Zeta demanded, her voice rising in panic. Gary stood his ground between the council agents and the dragons. I've fed them what they need, not just what you allow. Reality needs evolution, not stasis. You don't understand the consequences, Zeta cried. The engine of reality requires balance. Not your kind of balance, Gary countered. Not a forced artificial equilibrium that prevents growth. The chamber began to shake as the dragon's power grew. The chains, now fully transformed into glowing conduits, pulsed with energy that flowed not just through the dragons, but into the very walls of the chamber. The great realignment. Azurite's voice boomed, the sound distorted by temporal fluctuations. It begins early. 836 years early. Emberscale confirmed, its fiery voice crackling with unprecedented power. Prepare, Voidfang's empty voice warned, somehow both a whisper and a thunder. Ambassador Zeta and her agents rushed forward, devices in hand that Gary assumed were meant to subdue the dragons. He stepped forward to intercept them, but found himself frozen in place as reality itself seemed to pause. Everything stopped, the agents mid-stride, Gerald's concerned expression fixed in place, even the dust motes hanging suspended in the air. Only Gary, Morris, and the dragons remained in motion. We have created a moment between moments, Azurite explained, to give you a choice. The realignment will happen regardless now, Emberscale continued, but your role in what follows remains undetermined. You can stand with the council, Voidfang offered. Return to your life of deliveries and failed coffee dates. Or you can embrace your role as caretaker of evolution. All three dragons said together, help guide the changes to come. Gary looked at Morris, who sat alert on his shoulder. Asterisk your call. The lizard communicated. Asterisk. But for what it's worth, I've always thought you were meant for more than 3-mile deliveries. The choice seemed both monumentally significant and surprisingly easy. I'll stay, Gary said firmly. I'll help. The dragon's satisfaction was palpable, a wave of energy that washed through the chamber. Then let it begin, they intoned. Reality resumed its flow, but everything was different. The walls of the dragon chamber had become semi-transparent, revealing the engine of reality itself beneath and around them, a vast, complex mechanism of light and darkness, substance and void, time and space, all interconnected in patterns too intricate for Gary's mind to fully comprehend. The dragon's chains had completely transformed into conduits that connected directly to the engine, allowing their energy to flow freely into its workings. Under their influence, parts of the engine that had grown rigid and dull began to pulse with new life and possibility. Ambassador Zeta and her agent stood transfixed, their weapons forgotten as they witnessed the transformation. This is not destruction, Zeta whispered in awe. This is renewal. The dragons were changing too. Azurite's crystalline form became more fluid, incorporating aspects of both Emberscale's energy and Voidfang's void. Emberscale's molten body developed crystalline structures and void-like depths. Voidfang's emptiness became suffused with temporal patterns and energy flares. They were evolving beyond their individual domains, becoming something both more unified and more complex. The Trinity becomes the One, Gerald murmured, suddenly at Gary's side. It hasn't happened in countless millennia. As the transformation continued, Ambassador Zeta approached Gary cautiously. We were wrong, she admitted. Or rather, we were limited in our understanding. The Council has maintained the same perspective for so long. Perspective is everything. Gary replied, echoing what the dragons had taught him. From one view, they were sabotaging reality. From another, they were saving it from stagnation. Zeta removed her helmet for the first time, revealing a face with features that shifted subtly, moment to moment, never quite settling on a fixed appearance. There's something you should know. Gary Hoffman. The building where I found you, it only had 12 floors. But I lived on the 23rd floor, Gary protested. No, Zeta said gently. You believed you did. Reality had already begun shifting around you from the moment the toenail dissolved in your soup. Your connection to improbability was altering your personal reality even before you arrived here. Gary's mind reeled with the implications. So, I've been part of this all along? An agent of change without knowing it? We all are to some degree, Gerald interjected. But you have a particular affinity for it. That's why the toenail chose you. The transformation of the dragons and the engine eventually stabilized into a new configuration. The dragons remained distinct entities but also functioned as a unified force, their energies intertwining in harmonious patterns. The engine of reality pulsed with renewed vigor, its operations more fluid and adaptive than before. The Council agents, after witnessing the transformation, departed to report to their superiors. Ambassador Zeta chose to remain, appointed as a liaison between the evolving dragons and the presumably bewildered Council. Your contract will need renegotiation. She informed Gary with what might have been a smile on her ever-shifting features. Caretaker of Evolution is a more complex role than simple dragon feeder. Does it come with vacation time? Gary asked, only half joking. I think I've earned a break. 2 weeks annually, as promised. Zeta confirmed, though you might want to wait until things settle a bit before taking it. In the days that followed, Gary worked with the dragons to establish a new feeding routine that supported their evolved state. The meals became more creative, more conceptual, feeding them ideas and possibilities rather than just temporal artifacts and star energy. Morris took to his role as assistant caretaker with unexpected enthusiasm, developing a telepathic rapport with the dragons that allowed for more nuanced communication. I'm thinking of designing a throne, Morris told Gary one evening as they prepared for a feeding. Asterisk, nothing too ostentatious. Just something appropriate for the lizard who helped save reality from stagnation. Don't let it go to your head, Gary warned, though he couldn't help but smile. Remember, you still need me to catch your crickets. Asterisk details. Asterisk Morris dismissed. Asterisk, in the new reality, perhaps crickets will learn to self-sacrifice for the greater good. The dragons, overhearing this exchange, rumbled with what Gary had come to recognize as laughter. Your bond is an improbability we particularly enjoy. They communicated, human and lizard, both evolving beyond their original parameters. Gary realized they were right. He had changed profoundly since that day when a toenail clipping had dissolved in his soup. The nervous, self-doubting delivery man had evolved into someone confident, purposeful, a caretaker of evolution who had faced down the high council of improbable events and helped reshape reality itself. And yet, in other ways, he remained the same Gary Hoffman who talked to his pet lizard and couldn't work up the courage to ask a woman out for coffee. Perhaps that was the true nature of evolution, not abandoning what came before, but building upon it, incorporating it into something new and more complex. 6 months after the Great Realignment, Gary stood in the transformed dragon chamber, watching as the unified dragons wove patterns of improbability into the engine of reality. Morris perched on his shoulder, offering sarcastic commentary on particularly inventive probability manipulations. Ambassador Zeta discussed implementation strategies with council representatives who had finally accepted the necessity of controlled change. And Gerald prepared cosmic tea, served in cups that existed simultaneously in multiple states of being. It was improbable. It was evolution. Gary decided exactly where he was meant to be. To the caretaker of evolution, the dragons intoned, raising metaphorical glasses in a toast that rippled through reality itself. Gary raised his teacup in response, feeling the weight of his responsibility and the lightness of his newfound purpose in perfect, improbable balance. To evolution through improbability, he replied, and to cosmic toenails in soup. The dragons laughed, a sound that harmonized with the rhythms of the engine of reality, creating ripples of possibility that spread outward through existence, subtle changes and new potentials that would, in their own small ways, prevent stagnation and promote growth throughout the cosmos. And somewhere, in a disco dimension where the music never stopped, Mr. Blinglesnaw danced on, blissfully unaware that his cryptic journal entry had helped save reality from an eternity of unchanging order. Gary couldn't help but wonder what improbabilities awaited him in the future. Whatever they were, he was ready for them, one feeding, one evolution, one improbability at a time,